This is a true story. 5 people were in an enclosed device underwater, disassembling an oil pipeline. Due to the significant pressure difference, at the moment the screws were loosened, the pipeline sucked everything around into the underwater pipe. During the entire process, they were dragged from the pipe opening by a powerful suction force towards the far end of the pipe. The torment in the water lasted for over a minute. It was dark and filled with fear here. Fortunately, when the suction stopped, they found themselves at a slight bulge in the pipe, allowing the incoming air to gather here. Once they regained their composure, they counted each other and reported on their physical conditions. All 5 had varying degrees of abrasions. Among them, the second person was more seriously injured, with a fractured leg, and had lost consciousness. Additionally, all 5 oxygen tanks were missing due to the narrow space and limited air. It was unsuitable to wait long for rescue. They then discussed self-rescue strategies. One person thought they had come in head first, so they should back out in reverse. However, the other believed they came in feet first, so they could crawl forward. Thus, they followed the majority. In this pitch-black place, they could only move by pushing each other, like a centipede crawling, preventing anyone from being left behind. They could also give a push to help the injured comrade. While progressing, they discovered that 2 oxygen tanks from the job site had also been sucked into the pipe. The bad news was that the pipe ahead was underwater, so they would have to dive to proceed. However, there were only 2 oxygen tanks. And even worse, the length of the underwater section was unknown. Once they dove down, there would be no turning back. Another challenge was the injured comrade, who could barely crawl in a dry area, but would be completely immobile underwater, especially as he was in the second position. The others behind him also couldn't move forward. Chris decided to go forward alone with an oxygen tank. He promised that if he could get out, he would seek help to rescue his companions. If he failed and didn't return, it would mean he had met with misfortune. Everyone agreed with Chris's plan. Up until now, he was still unsure if he was heading in the right direction. So, Chris continued forward with a heavy heart. Shortly after, he found another section of the pipe was raised. This section was short. He took off his oxygen mask and rested briefly before moving on. This time, after diving down, he felt a true sense of despair. He didn't know how long he had been pushing on, exhausted. Even worse, based on his years of diving experience and his judgment of the oxygen level, his tank was nearly empty. His exhausted body made him want to give up multiple times. But just then, he heard a metallic clanging ahead. He reached out and felt another oxygen tank. To his surprise, Chris breathed a sigh of relief. He immediately pushed his current oxygen tank behind him to his stomach. Although the new tank had no mouthpiece, he didn't hesitate at all. He simply stuffed the whole thing in his mouth, enduring the taste of oil, and kept moving. His body was nearly exhausted, but with a new tank, he saw a glimmer of hope once more. After crawling arduously for several more minutes, he finally reached an upright pipe. At this moment, Chris was both excited and fearful. He worried this might be the wrong direction. Whether the end was closed or open depended on these last breaths. Chris gathered all his strength to swim upward. As he surfaced, he saw a beam of light. Although there was another empty pipe section he couldn't climb, a faint smile appeared on his face. Chris shouted towards the pipe's mouth, and sure enough, a head popped out. It was his colleague who worked on the ship. Due to not seeing any movement from the underwater crew for some time, the colleague had come down to check on them. He discovered everyone was missing. At that moment, he heard Chris's cries for help, but the ordeal wasn't over. After Chris was rescued, he described the situation inside the pipeline and requested a rescue. Chris was then taken directly to the ICU due to extreme exhaustion. Outrageously, Chris woke up the next day to learn that the oil company hadn't sent anyone to rescue them. Their reason was that the 4 people trapped in the pipeline couldn't possibly be alive. The oxygen tanks could only provide about an hour's worth of air. However, when someone dove down later and tapped on the section of the pipeline where the 4 were, they heard knocking sounds from inside. This indicated that they were still alive, yet the company still did not attempt a rescue. Later, they claimed that the conditions were unsuitable for a rescue, that the oil company had never intended to save them. A rescue would require dismantling the pipe, which wasn't in the capitalists' interests. Enraged, Chris stormed out of the hospital, but was restrained and given a sedative. On the 4th day, surprisingly, A diver went down and could still hear knocking inside the pipeline. Sadly, by the 5th day, they had all perished. After being discharged from the hospital, Chris could only take the oil company to court, hoping that justice would punish the wrongdoers.